What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome to the final video in our 40k new player tutorial series, at least for now, until we have something else to tutorialize about. This is playing missions in 9th edition Warhammer 40k. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on the GT2021 format, but most of the things we talk about in this video, in fact, almost all of them are identical across formats. Almost every version of 40k uses the same scoring structure. Some of the specifics about missions and secondaries and things like that will be a little bit different, but most of the at least 2,000 point games of 40k that are played use the GT 2021 format. I'm also going to be talking about this for the most part from the lens of a 2,000 point game of 40k. Things change a little bit when you're in lower points levels. Basically, the table size and the specific missions that you use will change. Just keep in mind that we're going to be starting talking about the standard 40k size, which is 2,000 points, and just going from there. Now, in previous videos, I've talked about a lot of how to set up the game, including the attacker and defender role in the first video, and how to build armies in our army building tutorial. And a lot of that is going to mesh into the pre-game phase that we talk about in this video. A lot of this also happens after you build your army list. So you and your opponent will both come to the table with a fully constructed army list with all of your pregame selections already noted down. Once that happens, and your terrain is laid out however you two see fit, a lot of times you'll be using a standardized terrain layout. For example, in this case, I just have for demonstration here one of the US Open terrain layouts. Then we'll go ahead and begin generating our mission. GT 2021 for both Incursion and Strike Force games, meaning 1,000 and 2,000 point games, have 9 total missions, and in order to generate them, you're going to roll 2 D3s. The first one representing the category of missions that you're going to pick, the second representing the particular mission that you'll be playing. In this case, all of the missions in GT 2021 are broken down by their first number, which is the result of the first D3 roll, and then their second number, which is the result of the second D3 roll. In this case, a 3 as your first one and a 2 as your second one, which means we would be playing mission 32. Each mission includes some parameters for scoring, a secondary objective that's optional for players to select if they want to. We'll talk about exactly how secondary objectives work later, and most importantly, an objective placement map that not only defines the player's deployment zone, which is where you're going to be placing your models as we described in the first video, as well as exactly where those objective tokens are going to be going. Now, one thing that's important to note is that all of the map layouts give you distances as they relate to the center of the table. This means that regardless of your table size, those deployment zones and objective markers are going to be the same distance from each other relatively. However, generally speaking, a game of Warhammer 40k is played on a 60-inch, so 5-foot by 44-inch board, and the objectives are sort of balanced around being placed on that table size. So in this case, if we look at 32 in the packet, that is going to be sweep and clear. Now, in TTS, obviously, everything gets done for us, which is very helpful. Thank you to the TTS gods. But as you can see here, we have our deployment zones getting marked out as they are in the map, as well as the objective tokens being placed for us. Now, in this situation, in a real space game, you would have to measure out the distances and the positions of each of those objective markers independently. Each of those distances measures to the center of the objective marker, and it's important to note that the objective markers themselves are not really physical objects. While there are some restrictions on where they can be placed in relation to terrain, and the terrain may have to shift depending on where the objective marker ends up going. The actual important part of the objective marker is the zone within 3 inches of it. So essentially a 6-inch plus 40 millimeter zone, so almost 7.5 inches, which is the area at which your models can interact with each of those objective markers. I'll explain how all of the other rules pertaining to each mission work shortly in the video, but now we have our mission and deployment zone set up. We're going to go ahead and pick secondary objectives. Now, scoring in 40k is broken down into 2 sections, the primary and secondary objective. The primary objective is scored by holding these points on the board, in this case, these 5 points. The secondary objective are player-selected objectives that you can pick from a huge list. The secondary objectives themselves are broken down into 6 categories. Battlefield Supremacy, which you'll score by having your models in various areas of the table. No Mercy, No Respite, which is sort of generically about winning the fight with your opponent's army and being able to win out on attrition. Shadow Operations, which is about performing specific actions on the battlefield, which we'll talk about momentarily. Purge the Enemy, which is about destroying specific enemy unit types. And Warpcraft, which are objectives specifically related to psychers or psychic actions. Lastly, we have mission-specific secondaries, and this is the last quote-unquote category. Now, there are several objectives to choose in each secondary, and I highly recommend you go through and read through the list of secondaries and pick which ones your army may be good at doing. I won't talk about picking secondary objectives in depth here. I do actually have another video on that, but a lot of the general concepts are there. The basic rules are that you can only have one objective out of each of the categories. Now, in addition to this, most codexes list a number of faction-specific secondaries that you can select as well. Each of those secondaries will also fall into one of those categories, so if you pick that objective, you wouldn't be able to pick another one out of the core list. You can only have one out of each of your lists of faction-specific secondaries, which means that some Space Marine chapters may have access to multiple faction-specific secondaries, one out of the Space Marine Codex and one out of each of their specific chapter supplements. So it is possible to have multiple faction-specific secondaries, but you can only have one out of each list, and the ones that you select still can't overlap with any of the categories you've already selected. The mission-specific secondaries don't have a different category, so you can choose them regardless of the other categories that you've taken. They're essentially just their own thing, but each mission has only one specific mission secondary that you can take. Those are optional, so if you don't feel like you can complete the mission-specific secondary, you can go ahead and discount that, but it is an option there if you need it. So we'll go ahead and select some secondary objectives by way of example. Over here on the Tabletop Simulator scorecard, we have our secondary objectives section at the bottom here. This is how most scorecards are going to look when you are scoring out your games of Warhammer 40k. We have primary objectives being laid out up here, broken down to each of the battle rounds you can score them in with your secondaries down here. This is your total score, which also includes points for painting your army, which we'll talk about later. Now, each secondary objective can only score up to 15 points, which means you have a grand total of 45 points available, and we'll go ahead and select some right now. So, for example, we could take Engage on All Fronts as our Battlefield Supremacy secondary, which locks us out of the other Battlefield Supremacy secondaries like Behind Enemy Lines and Stranglehold. We can then take, how about Retrieve Octarius Data? That's a pretty common one. That is a Shadow Operation secondary and would lock us out of any other Shadow Operation secondaries like Raise the Banners High or Deploy Teleport Homers. And then we'll go ahead and take a look at our opponent's list. Maybe they have a lot of monsters or vehicles, so we're going to go ahead and take Bring It Down, which will give us points for destroying those unit types. And that's a Purge the Enemy secondary, so that would lock us out of any other Purge the Enemy secondaries. Once you and your opponent both have your secondary objectives selected, these are meant to be secret, and you'll reveal them to each other simultaneously. You'll go on to the next step. Now, another thing to keep in mind that's mostly just for bookkeeping, but is an important thing to note, is that each of the objectives is labeled either progressive or endgame. This is just to notify you when the victory points for that objective are scored. For example, progressive objectives are scored throughout the course of the game. They progress, and you'll be tallying them as the game goes on. Endgame objectives usually check for a certain game state at the end of the game and will give you those points once the game's over. This is often things like, have you destroyed X number of unit types by the end of the game? A good example of that is the Bring It Down secondary that we spoke about earlier that scores you points for each monster or vehicle that you kill, but it only checks at the end of the game whether or not they've been destroyed. So technically, you wouldn't tally up your Bring It Down score immediately as soon as you kill those vehicles. Instead, you'd wait till the end of the game and give yourself a total score based on the total number. Again, it's mostly a bookkeeping thing, but there are some instances, especially when factions can regenerate units, where it does come into play in a big way. So after we've selected our secondary objectives, revealed them to our opponent, placed the objective tokens on the table, and determined attacker and defender, just like we talked about in the previous video, we go to a step called Declare Reserves and Transports. This is a step in which we'll spend CP to strategic or reserve our units, and like we talked about in the Advanced Rules video, and declare that our units will begin the game embarked on any of our transports. This is done simultaneously, and once that's done, we'll move on to deploying our armies like we talked about in the first video. After armies are deployed, both players roll off to go first, and the player that wins the roll-off will automatically take the first turn. Now, before we move on, A lot of secondary objectives, especially those in the Shadow Operations category or Warpcraft category, talk about performing actions. A lot of times people will use the term actions to refer to units doing their thing during a particular phase, but the rules actually only recognize this one thing as performing actions, which are generally special abilities that you use in order to score points based on particular objectives. Now, basically, there are two types of actions: standard actions and psychic actions. Psychic actions are their own thing. They aren't considered a standard action in and of themselves, but they're basically performed almost identically to a psychic power. We'll talk about those momentarily. The standard actions are a little bit more complicated, and we'll go ahead and grab one out of one of the secondaries to talk about. Let's talk about the Deploy Teleport Homers action. When you select the Deploy Teleport Homers objective, all of your infantry and biker units get access to this special action that's described by the secondary. The Deploy Teleport Homer action says one infantry or biker unit from your army can start to perform the action at the end of your movement phase if it is wholly within 12 inches of your opponent's deployment zone. The action is completed at the end of your next command phase, provided the unit is still wholly within 12 inches of your opponent's deployment zone. Actions have a clear start and end point. There are some restrictions to performing them and things you can't do while performing them without interrupting the action. You can never attempt to begin performing an action if you advanced, fell back, or are currently engaged in melee this turn. Also, some other types of units like aircraft and fortifications cannot perform actions. Generally, only infantry can perform actions, but that's not 100% the case, and a lot of the mission-specific secondaries are totally untethered to which units can perform them. Now, the unit performing the action will complete the action at the specified point, in this case, at the end of your next command phase, meaning the unit deploying the Teleport Homer would move to position in your movement phase. At the end of your movement phase, get the Teleport Homers out of their backpack and start fiddling with them. Assuming they survive back in your command phase, the action will be completed. That stops, however, if you do any of the following: are destroyed, make a normal move, advance, fall back, manifest a psychic power, declare a charge, perform a heroic intervention, or make any attacks with ranged weapons. If you do any of those things, the action fails and is not considered completed. However, obviously, after you hit the point where the action's completed, your unit is no longer fiddling with the Teleport Homers, you've scored your points, and they can go ahead and do something else just fine. In addition, while you're performing an action, any characters with aura abilities, these can be things like auras that give you reroll ones to hit in the shooting phase, for example, will turn off until the action's completed. So while it sounds complicated, thematically it kind of makes sense. You can imagine that your unit is preoccupied doing something, but if an enemy rushes onto you and you have to fire Overwatch, your models will put down the tools they're using to repair those Teleport Homers and fire at the enemy, which would be interrupting their work, and they'd have to start again from scratch in order to complete it. It's important to note, though, that you only don't complete an action if you perform any ranged attacks. If you are charged and perform melee attacks, your units will continue to perform the action, and that actually doesn't stop them whatsoever unless they're destroyed by that charge. You also can make moves as a result of piling in or consolidating, just not heroically intervening or performing movement phase style movements like normal moves, advanced charges, falls back, or charging itself. Now, the flip side of the coin for actions are psychic actions. These are used mostly for the Warpcraft style secondaries, and these are, on the whole, basically just psychic powers. You complete a psychic action if you pass a psychic test. Once you pass that psychic test, your opponent can attempt to deny it, exactly the same as we spoke about in the first video. In addition, you'll also suffer perils of the warp if you roll double ones or double sixes. The difference is that a caster attempting to perform a psychic action cannot attempt to manifest any additional psychic powers during the phase in which they perform a psychic action. So essentially, a psyker will attempt to perform that psychic action at the sacrifice of their entire psychic phase. This means that they're a lot more flexible than standard actions because you can advance and charge and still attack in the shooting phase, for example. However, you do lose a lot of your psychic output, so psychic actions can be pretty obnoxious if your army's built around getting a lot of psychic phase buffs applied. In addition, it's also important to remember that a lot of the Warcraft-specific psychic actions require you to perform them with characters. So if you have psychic units that are not characters in your army, a lot of times those will not be able to perform those actions. That's not a particular restriction on psychic actions per se, but it is a restriction on a lot of the secondaries that use them. So now we've talked about actions and how to score secondary objectives. Let's talk about the most important part of these missions, primary objectives. Primary objectives are scored at the start of your turn beginning on Battle Round 2. You score primary objectives based on the mission parameters and the objectives that you hold on the table. Now, there's a couple types of primary objectives in the GT 2021 format. Depending on the mission you're playing, you'll either be playing a take and hold mission, in which case, each round in your command phase, you will score 5 points for each of the first 2 objectives that you hold, and an additional 5 points for holding more than your opponent. Or you'll be playing domination, which only scores you 5 points total if you hold 2 objectives, 10 points if you hold 3 objectives, or 15 points if you hold more. Your primary objectives can be scored out to a maximum of 45 points, just like your secondary objectives, which gives you a total of 90 points that your objectives can score over the course of the game. Now we'll go ahead and run through some very basic scoring here on this mission. This is sweep and clear. This is a take and hold mission. So holding a single objective will get you 5 points, holding 2 objectives will get you 10, and holding more than your opponent will get you 15. So we'll go ahead and grab our pen here, and let's assume that the red player is currently holding this objective and this objective. The blue player is currently holding the objectives on the opposite side of the table. And the blue player, just having had their turn, has also been able to grab the center objective. That means that when it comes to the red player's turn, they would score 5 victory points for holding 1 objective, 10 victory points for holding 2 objectives. However, the blue player has more points than them, meaning that they would not score the 5 points for holding more objectives than their opponent. If the red player was holding the center objective, obviously they would then score to the 15, since they would be at a 3-2 lead. It's important to remember that this happens at the start of your turn, which means that you basically will have to get to an objective and hold it for an entire round in order to score points on that objective. Normally, this is marked on the score sheet by checking off these boxes for each criteria that you fulfill. In this case, holding 1 objective, holding 2 objectives, whether or not you hold more objectives than your opponent, for a maximum of 15 points per battle round. Objective tokens are held when you have more models within 3 inches of them than your opponent does. So whichever player outnumbers their opponent on the objective will hold that objective. If the 2 players are tied, the objective is considered contested, and neither player holds it. So in this instance, if we measure here, we have 4 Space Marine veterans within 3 inches of this objective marker and 3 Tyrannid Sky Slashers, which means that the Space Marines would outnumber the Tyrannids within 3 inches of that objective, and they would hold the objective. There is an ability that a lot of armies have access to. Most often you get them on all of the troops choices that are in your army, called Objective Secured. Objective Secured means that regardless of the number of models your opponent has on it. So, for example, if we went over and grabbed some Tyrannid Warriors here, who are Objective Secured, even if the Sky Slashers were not in range and we only had 1 Tyrannid Warrior within 3 inches of the objective, because of that Objective Secured rule, they would be holding the objective. If both players have Objective Secured models within 3 inches, it will revert to whoever has the most number of models there, regardless of whether or not those models are Objective Secured. So, for example, if the Space Marines have these 4 Vanguard veterans, the Tyrannids have the 2 warriors. If they brought over the 3 Sky Slasher swarms, if we assume that the veterans are Objective Secured, even though the Sky Slasher swarms are not themselves Objective Secured, the Tyrannids would hold this objective, having 5 models in that aura versus just the 4 of the veterans. Read your codex for exactly how your units get access to this. Some codexes give out Objective Secured to more than just your troops options, but for the most part, the troops in any of your correctly formulated detachments will automatically gain that Objective Secured ability. Now, for objective scoring, this is going to matter at the end of each of your command phases, when the scenario will check who controls this objective for the purposes of scoring primary objective victory points. We'll go ahead and do another example of primary objective scoring. This mission is going to be Overrun, which is a domination mission. So this means that in order to score 5 points, each player will have to hold 2 objectives, and they'll only get 15 points for holding 3. So in this case, we'll assume that the red player has good control of the objectives on their side of the table, and the blue player is going to be holding their objectives over here. This means at the start of the red player's turn, because they hold 1 and 2 objectives, this one might be contested, I guess, they would only score 5 points because of that domination criteria. The blue player in this game state, however, would score 5 points for holding at least 2, 10 points for holding at least 3, and 15 points for holding more than the red player. So you can see that these domination missions tend to be a little bit harder to hold on to and a little bit more swingy, since holding 1 objective could mean the difference between a 5-point turn and a 15-point turn. Keep in mind, though, that you can only max out your primary objectives at 45 points. So even if you've dominated your opponent and scored 15 points every turn, you're only going to get that 45 points on primary. Now, the last wrench to throw in here are locking objectives. We'll go back to Sweep and Clear here because this is one of the 2 missions out of the Strike Force missions in GT 2021 that uses locking objectives. This mission and Vital Intelligence both use this mechanic. And this means that the objective remains under your control as long as you control it at the end of your command phase. So essentially, as soon as a player scores off an objective, that remains under their control and locks in for them until their opponent comes and takes it at the end of any subsequent phase. This means that the other player doesn't necessarily have to score on the objective themselves in order to grab it. They just have to touch it, and at the end of a phase, have more models or OBSEC models when you don't within range of the objective in order to grab it. But this does mean that the objective remains under your control even if you move it. So if these Space Marine veterans, for example, started on this objective, they would hold it at the beginning of their command phase, it would lock in to the red player's side, then they could move off, and even if there were no models here, the red player would still be considered controlling this objective for each subsequent scoring iteration. Again, there are only 2 missions that use this. It's Vital Intelligence and Sweep and Clear, at least in the Strike Force version of the packet, but that is an important mechanic to keep in mind. Now, this scoring occurs, like we mentioned, at the end of each player's command phase every round until you get to Battle Round 5. On Battle Round 5, if you are the second player, because it's often more difficult for the second player to score over the course of the game, because the first player will get the first opportunity to move up and score objectives, you instead score all your primary objective points at the end of your turn instead of at the end of your command phase. So for example, let's say the blue player is going second, and at the start of their turn, the game state would look something like this. The red player in control of these 4 objectives. Instead of scoring their 5 points like they normally would, the blue player does not score at the start of their turn, and instead then gets the ability to move their models. We'll say they have some Tyranid Gene Stealers, which have the ability to move pretty far over the course of a turn with all the Tyranid stratagems and abilities. And they're going to be able to chain between several objectives. Assuming the blue player was able to clear off all the enemy models there, or there weren't any enemy objective secured models to contest them, the Gene Stealers would then flip these 2 objectives over to the control of the blue player, and that would give them a 3-2 lead, giving them a full 15-point primary turn on the bottom of round 5. A lot of times you'll hear players commenting about the bottom round 5 scoring that GT 2021 gives you, and this is a function of that. It gives the second player a little bit more control of their scoring if they're able to survive throughout the course of the game, in exchange for the first player getting the first opportunity to score. It's mostly a little bit of a balancing factor and gives the second player a huge leg up in the late game. So once round 5 is over, both players will tally out the number of secondary objectives that they might have scored. Both their progressive secondaries and their endgame secondaries will be added up at this point. And then on top of that, each player will add 10 points to their score if their army is fully painted. And the player with the highest result out of that possible 100 points, 45 for primaries, 45 for secondaries, plus 10 for being painted, will give you the winner. And that's it. That's how you play and score missions in the GT 2121 format, the most common format in playing especially 2,000-point games of Warhammer 40,000. And that concludes the entirety of our How to Play Warhammer 40k series. Let me know down in the comments below if you found this video series helpful. And if you want to support the channel, we got a couple ways you can do that. You can head on over to our Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise or join the YouTube membership at the button down below. Both of those will give you access, if you join at the second tier, to our Advanced Tactics series, which has some additional deep dives on Warhammer 40,000 tactics and particularly tactical topics. I hope you found this video series super helpful. I also hope that you remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming. Battlefield Supremacy, No Mercy, No Respite, Shadow Operations. I should describe each one of them. That is how that works, right? That didn't get eroded. Now I'm going to double check, though, because I'm second-guessing myself. There was something I was going to say.